Hi, Robert. How are you?
I'm fine, Douglas. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Your bio's very impressive. I got a kick out of many things on there, but the one thing I wanted to say that I thought was really cool was that you were one of the first science fiction authors to be online in 1995.
First science fiction in the world to have a website. The first Canadian author of any type, the first science fiction writer in the world to have a website, 1995. Went online in June. And indeed, I was also, as a matter of fact, a very early adopter. I've been online as a person on the web, well, before there was a web, since 1983. But I was the first person to have a website, yes, as a science fiction writer.
Wow, that's great. Did you started about the same time that Jeff Bezos did.
I beat him. I was online before Amazon was online.
Wow, that's great.
Not ironically, I think it's actually somewhat related, is the fact that Jeff reads my books.
Does he? Oh, great. You also are a member of the Order of Canada. Is that the sort of Canadian equivalent of an MBE?
It is exactly the counterpart of a member of the Order of the British Empire. The closest American equivalent would be the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It is the highest honor given by my country. And again, as we talk about firsts, not wanting to brag or anything, but the first person ever to get it for work in the science fiction field. To put that in perspective, the second person ever to get to become a member of the Order of Canada for work in the science fiction field was William Shatner for his portrayal of Captain Kirk and the rest of his work.
Speaking of Star Trek, you did some writing for Star Trek. There's an online. I didn't even know about this. Tell us about that.
Star Trek Continues is a series of 12 full length original series episodes made on meticulously recreated sets in Kingsland, Georgia, starring Vic Mignogna and Todd Haberkorn, who are two very famous anime voice actors, as respectively Kirk and Spock. The writers, yes, you're kind enough to mention that I wrote the two-part series finale, To Boldly Go. We also had Judy Burns write for us. Judy wrote the original, The Tholian Web, for the third series of Star Trek, the original series, and she came back half century later and wrote a sequel to The Tholian Web for us. Guest stars in the series are incredible. Our first episode has Michael Forrest reprising the role of the god Apollo that he had played in the original series episode Who Mourns for Adonais. And we also have Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk himself, Aaron Gray, Wilma Deering from Buck Rogers. The list just goes on and on. Kaz Abnar from The Expanse, an incredible, what's his name? Not Sylvester McCoy, Colin Baker, excuse me, the sixth Doctor Who, just John Delancey, not playing Q, but returning to a different role in the Star Trek universe for us. Just everybody involved was a professional. Everybody did the best work they possibly could. You can go see it all at StarTrekContinues.com.
So this is an all-new cast, but is it the same characters? Because you remember the Next Generation had Captain Picard, and they had a whole different characters.
They had absolutely a whole different suite of characters, and what we've done is not do that. We have the classic characters, all of them performed by new actors. But that said, for Scotty, for instance, Scotty is performed by not James Doohan, but by Christopher Doohan. James Doohan's son plays Scott for us. Sulu, very sadly, the actor just passed away, Grant Imahara, best known to many for his work as one of the hosts of Mythbusters, played Lieutenant Sulu for us, and so on and so forth.
How did you get started writing science fiction? What was the spark that, I assume you've been doing this a long time?
Well, my first novel came out 30 years ago. My first short story sold 40 years ago. So, yeah, it's fair to say that I'm one of the old farts of the genre now. But my start in wanting to write science fiction even predates me reading a science fiction novel. And I'll tell you how. In 1972, when I was 12 years old, my older brother gave me a used hand-me-down copy of a novel called Trouble on Titan by an author named Alan E. Nurse, Nourse, Alan E. Nurse. And it began with an introduction by Nurse entitled I've Never Been There, about the joys of writing science fiction. Well, I read that first. So even before I'd read my first science fiction novel, I'd read this guy, Alan Nurse, saying, hey, it's the best job in the world, and real people could be you. Do it for a living. And so I was hooked from the notion at the outset. Then you mentioned Star Trek. I was just enamored by the first ever making of book of any kind. There'd never been a making of book. Now they're everywhere for every property. Until 1968, I didn't read it then, but that's when it came out. The Making of Star Trek by Stephen E. Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. And it was all about the memos back and forth between the producers about trying to decide what Vulcan names should sound like. We've established Spock. What should the other names be? What are the capabilities of the starship? All that world building fundamentals. And I was just amazed. And I wanted to play that game professionally. And I have for my entire career.
What was the first thing you wrote?
First thing I wrote, that was published or that I ever wrote?
That was published.
First thing I ever wrote was Bobby Bug, I'll have you know. Bobby Bug in 1967. And miracle of miracles, if you go to McMaster University, which houses the Robert J. Sawyer Archives, or in Hamilton, Ontario, you can see the original manuscript for Bobby Bug in my pencil scrawl as a 7-year-old. First thing I had the first significant thing was my first novel, I would say, and that was Golden Fleece. Kind of my response to 2001: A Space Odyssey. I had never understood, I loved 2001, and I even understood 2001. I explained it to my dad, who had taken me to see it as an 8-year-old. But what I didn't understand was the psychology in 2001 of why Hal decided committing murder was the right course of action. Never made sense in the film. Of course, Clark wrote sequels trying to explain why it did perhaps make sense. But I wrote a novel about a murdering computer aboard a starship and tried to get into the actual psychology, not a programming glitch, but the kind of artificial intelligence psychology that might lead to committing murder. And that's my first novel, Golden Fleece.
Is all of this technology, artificial intelligence, is this good or bad for mankind?
Yes. Well, you ask a very interesting question, because it's one or the other for sure. And ultimately, we won't know until we really have artificial consciousness. Right now, absolutely no question. Not 5 minutes before the interview began, I had to know for my work how far away Jupiter was in light minutes from Earth right now. A science fiction writer, totally legitimate question for me to be wondering about. And so I asked my Amazon assistant, and she told me instantly, way faster than I could have found the figure, even Googling online. She had it for me. Right now, AI is entirely benign because it has no agenda of its own. Whether that'll always be the case, that'll be the test. And then we will either have a wonderful partnership that will last forever, which is what I hope, and portrayed in my novels Wake, Watch, and Wonder, about a utopian win-win scenario for AI and humanity, or we'll have the 3 other classic science fiction scenarios. We started with Star Trek. Let's continue with them. The Borg scenario, AI will absorb us. The Matrix scenario, AI will enslave us. And then there's the Terminator scenario, AI will exterminate us. Those are the four squares on the grid.
Yeah.
And which one of those four will end up being our future, we don't yet know. But there's only one of those four that's a win-win, and we're winners. Every other one is win-lose, and we're a loser.
Quickly, tell us about your book, The Oppenheimer
The
Alternative.
Oppenheimer Alternative, behind me, there's my 24th novel, and it's classified as an alternate history, but I call it a secret history. There's a distinction I'll get to in a second about Robert Oppenheimer, there he is in profile on the cover, and the Manhattan Project, which was the United States / Canada / Great Britain effort in World War II to create the world's first atomic weapons. Robert Oppenheimer was the scientific director of that project. And the Oppenheimer Alternative starts off by telling some of the history of that project, and then, not to jump ahead in the time of the story, but in the 1950s, early 50s, during the McCarthy era, so after the Manhattan Project had concluded successfully by creating atomic bombs, Oppenheimer was put on a security clearance hearing, which he lost. He was stripped of his Q level, which is atomic secrets level security clearance, in a government witch hunt show trial. And he said to a reporter, he really did, if you dug deeply enough, you would find that there's a way bigger story going on than just my security clearance hearing. Well, nobody ever found out what that story was. I'm a science fiction writer. I knew that Oppenheimer was not an atomic physicist, but an astrophysicist before he entered the war effort. And I contrived to write a secret history that hinges on Oppenheimer's expertise in astrophysics that doesn't contradict anything we know in the historical record about his life or the history of the Manhattan Project, but is way more interesting, just as Oppie said it would be, than the public story we know about him and his life. That's The Oppenheimer Alternative by me, Robert J. Sawyer.
Well, great. And on that, we've got to wrap up the interview. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was nice talking to you. What is your website? You want to give out a website?
We talked at the beginning. How do you get a great URL? You get in early. And as the first science fiction writer in the world to have a website, mine is sfwriter.com. S as in science, F as in fiction, writer.com, sfwriter.com. And you'll find me on Patreon, Twitter, and Facebook with my full name, Robert J. Sawyer, just without the spaces and the period. All run together. Robert J. Sawyer. There I am online.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This
An
was
absolute pleasure.
Pleasure speaking with you.
Stay well.